One of the takeaways from Stuart Hall's discussion of the media is that representations, meaning images, words, or anything else that transmits information about the world, don't always work. Representations don't always work. They don't always achieve the goal of making the audience understand or think what the producer wants them to understand or think about the world, let alone get the audience to do what the producer wants them to actually do in the world. Sometimes media consumers' takeaway from the news or any other kind of media is very different than what the producer intended. As I previously discussed, sometimes the listener decodes a message in opposition to the intentions and interests of the speaker. If we're interested very narrowly in the problem of fake news, the question is, what makes people believe information that isn't true, and what makes them disbelieve information that is true? But we can extend this more broadly to the question of what makes media effective in winning over its audience. Or as Michael Schudson puts it, what makes culture work sometimes, but not others? In his article, How Culture Works, Schudson, who's a sociologist and a professor of journalism at Columbia University, and who was actually one of my teachers, Schudson talks about cultural objects and the debate over how much power they actually hold over recipients, that is, the media consumers. And cultural objects is kind of his synonym for representations, for the contents of media. And it's important, by the way, to recognize that some of our authors use the same words to denote different things and also use a variety of words to talk about the same thing. So again, as well as hopefully Stuart Hall taught us, the meaning of any symbol, any representation, like for example, the word culture or the word representation, is never truly fixed and stable. Anyway, Schudson outlines two kind of schools of thought about cultural objects, about representations transmitted through the media. The first school of thought, which he calls the social mold view, holds that ideas and symbols powerfully shape or mold people. This is kind of the assumption of a lot of Marxist approaches to the media that I went over in the first lecture, right? So propaganda works. The ruling class can force ideas that serve their interests onto the subaltern class. They can mold the subaltern. But then there's a very different view of cultural objects that some sociologists hold, which Schudson calls the toolkit view. According to this view, the toolkit view of culture, Schudson writes, quote, "Culture is not a set of ideas imposed, but a set of ideas and symbols available to use. Individuals select the meanings they need for particular purposes and occasions from a limited but nonetheless varied cultural menu a given society provides." In this view, culture is a resource for social action more than a structure to limit social action. So according to the toolkit view, media doesn't really act upon us. Instead, we act upon media. We take messages we like, interpret them as we see fit, and act according to our own strategic interests, and then just kind of use cultural objects to achieve our goals. So for example, if I'm running for political office, I might wear a flag pin and quote from the Constitution, but that doesn't mean that I'm actually internalizing the ideas and the original message and intentions of the writers of the Constitution. I might just be cynically kind of using the Constitution, which is a cultural object, as a tool for winning votes. And same thing if I'm a media consumer. If I listen to a speech by a political candidate, I'm not necessarily being molded into conformity with what that candidate says. I might just take a few of their words out of context, interpret them according to my own beliefs and kind of use them as a tool for re-existing my pre-existing beliefs, which might be very different than those of the speaker, the political candidate. So these models, the social mold model and the toolkit model, can apply equally to both producers and consumers of the media, which, by the way, we ultimately we all are. We're both constantly taking on both the roles of producer and consumer. We receive information, say we watch the nightly news, and then we decode it and re-encode it in turn when we speak to our friends or post on social media or whatever. We're both transceivers, both taking and giving cultural objects. And in our capacity as a receiver, a consumer, we might be shaped by the news according to the social mold views, expectations, or we might choose to decode the news as it serves our strategic interests and according to what we already believe about the world. Then as a transmitter, a producer, we might turn around and recite the same thing that we just heard on the news, like a programmed kind of robot, or we might just kind of select bits of the news, or we might totally misrepresent it in ways that serve our interest when we later speak with our friends. What I think is often the case is that we tend to apply the toolkit view to the powerful and the mold view to the powerless. So when members of the elite, or people who we perceive to be members of the elite, express a view or make some claim, we think of it as being to serve their strategic interests. Whereas when poor people express a belief, it's because they're brainwashed, right? Whether by political propaganda or religion or whatever, they've been molded. But that's not necessarily true, right? The powerful are also influenced by the culture around them. They're also molded, and the weak are also capable of creativity and of strategic thinking. So to return to the article, Schudson doesn't want to kind of assume that people are always molded by cultural objects, or on the other hand, that they always are just using cultural objects as tools. He also doesn't want to assume that certain groups or classes always do one while other groups always do the other. These are open questions, not assumptions that we should have. Instead, he asks, what are the conditions in which cultural objects work, and what are the characteristics of cultural objects that work? And by work, Schudson means what makes a message, a signal, a representation operate as an effective tool from the producer's perspective, which is kind of the same thing as asking what makes that cultural object, that representation, an effective mold of the consumer, the recipient of that culture. And Schudson discusses 5 dimensions, 5 factors that influence the effectiveness of the message, its kind of potency. And they all begin with R's, which I find actually makes it more difficult to remember, but here you are. So the 5 R's are retrievability, rhetorical force, resonance, institutional retention, and resolution. So I'll go through each of them. When he says retrievability is important, Schudson is saying really quite simply, if culture is going to influence a person, it has to reach that person, right? For a radio broadcast to mold somebody, they have to actually have access to a radio receiver and be within range of the transmitter. So, maybe score 1 here for the Marxists who argue that the ruling class's ideas are dominant because they're the ones who own the means of mental production, of media production. Right? If you own all the radio stations, you can influence a lot more people because you can simply reach them. Your broadcast will be retrievable to them. Of course, even as the means of mental or media production and distribution have become kind of more widely available, the same limitations imposed on retrievability exist. So for example, for some extremist online message board to radicalize somebody, that person has to have an internet connection. They have to be literate, right, in the language, in the colloquial sense, the language used on the boards. And they also have to know how to find that website. Similarly, right, for your brilliant blog to change the way that a reader thinks about the world, a link to it has to actually show up in their Google search results or on their Twitter feed or whatever. And there's actually been a lot of brilliant investigative reporting that simply isn't retrievable to millions to billions of people around the world because they don't know where to find it, because they're unable to decode it because of language barriers, because they aren't shown it, or maybe because that content is hidden behind paywalls. Or maybe they can't find it because kind of algorithms determining social media and search engine relevance rankings are designed to maximize tech companies' advertising revenues, not to provide users with the most reliable and intellectually enriching information possible. So that's retrievability, and that's why retrievability is a continued problem, even as we think of ourselves as having kind of access to an infinite, almost infinite amount of information in the internet age. Now, the second R, the second factor that Schudson talks about, is rhetorical force. The rhetorical force of a cultural object is actually internal to that object. It's a property that some messages possess and some lack. So contrary to kind of the idea of orthodox toolkit theories, that media is simply whatever we make of it, and contrary to the notion that representation doesn't have any inherent meaning, Schudson's actually saying that there is maybe something about certain messages that just makes them more compelling. If I'm running for office and I come up with a campaign slogan that has a clever rhyme scheme or play on words, maybe it's more likely that people will remember it and repeat it and be influenced by it. If I show you an image of graphic violence, maybe there's something about the image itself, a certain kind of shock value that the image inherently possesses in the way that it's framed and in terms of the what it depicts, that really grabs the attention. Or by contrast, maybe if I want to present myself as kind of a serious, objective social scientist, maybe my representation of the world, right, the journal article or the book that I publish, maybe I'll get taken more seriously and be more influential if I write in a really boring way with lots of big words that kind of make me look smart. So the argument here about rhetorical force is about the properties, the inherent properties of the cultural object. It gets blurry, though, of course, because, for example, in the example that I just gave about the boring journal article, of course, our standards and our expectations of what constitutes a boring article and how a real scientist writes are themselves culturally constituted. And I think it's easy to confuse resonance with rhetorical force, but the difference is really going to lie along kind of this axis of the inherent properties of the object and the culture, the kind of background of the recipient of the message, if that makes sense. So whereas a representation's rhetorical force stems from its own properties, right, the style in which it's written, maybe the bright colors or loud noises that it uses, and so on, a representation's resonance depends on the audience, on whether the representation seems relevant to their lives and their interests, and whether it fits in with their tradition, kind of what they already think they know about the world. This is the key difference between resonance and rhetorical force. Resonance is much more about the audience member's approach to the material rather than the inherent properties of that material. But in practice, of course, these two things are almost inseparable, almost always tied up together. But about resonance, Schudson writes, and I quote here, "The relevance of a cultural object to its audience, its utility, if you will, is a property not only of the object's content or nature and the audience's interest in it, but of the position of the object in the cultural tradition of the society the audience is a part of." That is, the uses to which an audience puts a cultural object are not necessarily personal or idiosyncratic. The needs or interests of an audience are socially and culturally constituted. What is resonant is not a matter of how culture connects to individual interests, but a matter of how culture connects to interests that are themselves constituted in a cultural frame. So the argument that Schudson is making here is that, okay, the audience always does its own decoding work, making meaning, and using representations in front of them in their own ways for their own ends. But how people make meaning and what they choose to focus on and make meaningful is not random. And it's also not completely determined by the individual. We all live within cultures in the more colloquial sense of the word, right? We're all taught that we're part of larger groups, whether nations or ethnicities or religions or genders or whatever. We're all taught that there are some fundamental unities within the cultures that we're a part of. And so as social creatures interested in fitting in with the group with which we identify, which is necessary in order to survive and to thrive socially, we attune ourselves to what those other members of our group are doing, what their beliefs and values are, or what the beliefs and values are that they're expressing, what cultural objects they're paying attention to and constantly referring back to, perhaps with reverence, whether that's the Bible or the Constitution or the New York Times or Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And we're more receptive to information that fits into what we already believe or what we already think that we ought to be thinking about, if that makes sense. That's what resonates with us. So if you're the producer of a cultural object and want to win over your audience, you'll most likely be more successful if you can make your messages resonate with that audience. So if it's a religious audience, maybe you quote scripture and fit your argument into that pre-existing religious worldview, for instance. So I hope that distinction is clear between rhetorical force and resonance, right? Things, of course, in any real life case, things are going to look blurry, but when Schudson talks about rhetorical force, he's talking more about the characteristics, the properties of the cultural object itself, and resonance is more about how that cultural object, resonates with what audiences already think, with the pre-existing culture of the audience. The fourth R that Schudson discusses is institutional retention. The idea here is that if you really want a cultural object to mold people, you have to figure out how to continue to be retrievable to them for a long time, and also even how to force them to continue paying attention to you. Of course, the longer you can keep hammering home kind of the same point and forcing people to listen, the more a message is going to resonate with people, right? Because they'll be like, oh yeah, I think I heard that before somewhere. Or a message will already kind of fit in with stuff that they've already learned. And there are, in fact, some cultural objects that have both rhetorical force and resonance when they do reach people, but fail to continue to reach them and fail to be forced upon them, basically, because they aren't institutionally retained. This is kind of the way fads and memes work, right? There's something that everybody's talking about that's catching everybody's attention one day, but then it's gone the next. But the cultural objects that Schudson argues are most effective at molding us are the ones that become kind of a part of our official culture, our culture with a capital C, because they get adopted in school curricula or get put into museums or added to rituals, religious or secular kind of rituals. If you went to a public school in America, you almost certainly have the Pledge of Allegiance memorized. That's been drilled into your head because that's a text that's been retained by the institution of public education. And you also might have gotten into trouble with your teacher or felt peer pressure if you didn't stand up and recite it every morning in elementary school. So there's an element of coercion also with institutional retention. To give another example of institutional retention, if you submit a proposal for an academic book to a publisher, as I've recently learned, one of the things they ask you is what university courses you think are going to assign your book. And this is because if an academic book, which is probably pretty boring and not likely to just be read by generations of people just for fun on the beach, if an academic book is not institutionally retained in course syllabi, if there isn't a threat from professors that if students don't read that book, then they'll get an F, then far fewer people are ever going to read that book. It won't be as effective of a cultural object. And of course, fewer copies will be sold, which is one of the concerns, one of the big concerns of the publisher. Okay, so the final R, the last factor in the effectiveness of a cultural object that Michael Schudson discusses, the last factor in whether culture works or not, is resolution. So if a news story, an argument, an advertisement is going to matter, it helps if it directs the audience toward taking some kind of concrete action, not just reacting with, wow, that's interesting, but so what? Now, the so what is kind of obvious with an ad, right? Go out and buy the product we're showing you. But often it can be less obvious with, for example, a news story. So what Schudson argues is that a news story perhaps has the biggest effect on an audience when it makes clear to them what they should do next in response to the thoughts and emotions that the story has stirred up in them. That you should go write to your government representative about some unjust policy, or you should go cast your vote in a particular way, or go out into the streets and protest, or donate to a charity that's mentioned or linked in the article. Or maybe the resolution is that you should go online and troll the evildoer whom the story attacks. These would all be cases of a clear kind of resolution for the audience of what they should do with that cultural object. Schudson does allow that even cultural objects that don't have this kind of direct, obvious, immediate call to action can make a big difference, although kind of a subtler difference in molding audiences' behaviors, even if they're not calling for some immediate behavior. And that's because even a message without kind of obvious immediate resolution can instigate action in the long run by shaping our worldviews and our sense of our own place in the world, by molding the way in which we decode future messages we receive. This can kind of be the resolution, is a message gets you to decode future messages in a particular way, right? Which basically adds to or subtracts from our cultural toolkits that we carry around with us. This is an important point and one that I'm really going to expand on in the next video when I talk about James Carey's argument that communication through media is actually what creates culture and community. But that's all for now for my discussion of Michael Schudson and the article How Culture Works.